Thanks very much for coming along tonight. This meeting's been arranged by the Golden Star and Homage on the subject of Scots fighting fascism in Spain, 1936 to 1938. My name is Rob Gordon. I'm the secretary of the Greater Glasgow HOPE group, which is an anti-fascist organisation. This meeting has actually been held as part of the STUC's Our Future Free from Racism programme 2014. That's a programme of different organisations that have included events in the programme, really in order to raise awareness of anti-racism, anti-fascism, and also to celebrate our history and challenging it. Tonight's meeting will concentrate on the Scottish contribution to the International Brigades, a volunteer army which drew working class men and women across the globe to fight against Spain's fascist regime led by General Franco. Glasgow and surrounding areas provided many recruits for international brigades, and certainly the comrades paid the ultimate sacrifice are remembered. For example, we've got a plaque outside in the main foyer which lists the 65 comrades who died for Glasgow. We've also got the statue to the Merchant House Quay, which is a Passionaria. That was unveiled actually nearly 35 years ago to the day. It was on the 5th of December 1979. It was Arthur Dooley that actually commissioned that. Of course, it bears the well-known slogan, better to die on your feet than live forever on your knees. So it's my great pleasure to introduce author Daniel Gray. He's written several books, but tonight he's going to talk about his excellent work. It's Homage to Catalonia, which documents the many different volunteers for Scotland to fight fascism in Spain. And also, incidentally, it was the basis of an STV two-part documentary, The Scots Who Fought Franco. So, ladies and gentlemen, we'll hand you over to Daniel Gray.
Thanks for having me along tonight. I recognise some comrades I've met before, and I've been here a few times doing talks on different books and things, and it's a hub for this move. The trade union movement's a hub for everything that happened in Spain, really, so it's important to make that first connection. And the second connection, why I'm glad to be here, is how much we find in Spain that's important and relevant today in opposing fascism, and of course it's changed and it has a suit on these days and things. But to make that link is really important, and one of the first times I did stuff with is either Hope Not Hate or another anti-fascist charity was when I lived in Newcastle about 14 odd years ago, and we were out leafleting in a council estate, and an old woman came out shouting at us going, "Get away, get away!" And she come and shouted, "I didn't want you bastards round here!" And I thought, oh God, she must be a real fascist, and what it was she'd seen Nick Griffin on our leaflets and thought we were fascists, and said, "I remember that the first time around." And she was making that connection and remembering exactly what fascism was like in the 30s and 40s with whatever clothes they wear now, whether it's UKIP at the minute or the EDL, SDL, whatever they are, the name changes. Even in my, probably shorter than some of you, opposing fascism, I've seen an awful lot of different names, but it's the same horrific ideology as this one. And we're just probably lucky that we don't have to pick up old rifles to fight it in our age yet. But I wrote this book 6 years ago now, and I've written 3 books since. My only advertising plug tonight is my new book that came out a month ago, and it's a lovely Christmas present, and it's a mix of photography and story. There's a lot of social and radical history in it. I went around Scotland with a photographer friend. This is called This is Scotland, and that's my only advertising piece. Not particularly to make much money from it, we just wanted to document the last 6 months before the referendum, and we don't even mention the referendum ones. We thought it'd be nice to capture everyday Scotland, talk a lot about radical politics. I don't just mention that as an advertisement, but because there are elements in this that I imagine some people here would enjoy. But that's to illustrate. In between that, I wrote 2 books about football and travel and social history as well. One on Scotland, one on England. So I've sort of forgotten a lot of this, so I've gone back to the script, and I noticed the last time I talked to an audience about this was the Rotary Club. Actually, I was amazed to be invited to, and perhaps you have some different politics to the Rotary Club, and perhaps I do, but it was an interesting occasion, I can assure you. So I'll talk for around half an hour and tell stories of those people that fought, also nursed and fundraised, and then we'll talk afterwards. Between 1936 and 1939, some 549 Scots served in the Spanish Civil War. Around a quarter of them are still in Spain, sleeping under the soil they volunteered to fend from fascism. 70 years have passed since the end of the conflict they gave their lives to. They were fascist warfare's early victims, felled by the same Luftwaffe in Spain that would later wreak havoc across Europe. In Spanish fields, foreign politics were played out as ordinary Scots became the victims of manoeuvrings plotted in London, Berlin and Moscow. Barbaric and visceral, this rehearsal for World War II left 500,000 dead and established General Franco's dictatorship. The Spanish Republic Scots had fought for was emphatically quashed. Demonstrating a prescience lacking from the British governments of the 1930s, Scots had illegally journeyed to Spain to quell the threat of pan-European combat. They went too as an extension of domestically waged campaigns against unemployment, poverty and British fascism. The cause of the Spanish Republic came to embody every struggle the Scottish working class was embroiled in. On Spanish shores went logic steeped in the progressive tradition they could build a better, fascism-free tomorrow to be exported home. Scotland can be proud of them. In Spain's war, the Scottish people found a cause that struck a chord with them like no other had, or perhaps has since. What happened in Spain and in support of Spain has to be seen in the context of 1930s Scotland. It was there and then that domestic and foreign struggles became connected. The 1930s in Scotland were a time of intense activity and idealism. Political fires burned and crackled unremittingly. On corners, men and women gathered to listen to the airs of John Maclean spouting socialism and anti-fascism, their incendiary words firing working-class solidarity. They became inspired to fight fascism in its every form, and wherever it cropped up. All of this has to be viewed in the wider context of just how radical this Scotland was. It was a country of communist councillors and members of parliament and seemingly endless waves of strike action, protest marches and demonstrations. Members of these movements nailed their colours to the mast of the Spanish Republic from the moment war broke out in Spain in July 1936. Their Scotland was one of entrenched hardship. The plague of mass unemployment engulfed the land. Poverty and infant mortality rates were among the worst in Europe and beyond. Yet instead of turning to the reactionary politics of scapegoating by looking to the British Union of fascist Frances, Scottish poverty bred the radical politics of socialist hope and faith in united actions to win a better tomorrow. They created a national unemployed workers' movement to give voice to the anxieties and ire of the redundant and impoverished masses. That NUWM instigated a number of hunger marches down to London, and many of those who partook in these went on to fight in Spain. As Scottish NUWM leader Harry McShane suggested, many of the marchers understood the significance of the war, and some expressed the desire to fight in Spain for the Republic. There was a clear conjoining of issues: Spain was another prong of the struggle. This support for the Spanish Republic was underpinned by an opposition to fascism that appears to have come naturally to Scots. It was a deep-seated and innate antipathy to fascism, whether in Scotland or further afield. If, ran the consensus, fascism was not defeated in Spain, it would soon have to be defeated on an unknown and unparalleled scale at home instead. Bombs on Madrid today means bombs on Scotland tomorrow became a common slogan. Many of those Scots who became embroiled in anti-fascist action on the streets of Scotland would later fight in Spain. It was almost as if it didn't matter where fascism cropped up, whether in the Calton fighting the British Union of Fascists or in Catalonia taking on Franco, Hitler, Mussolini. In Aberdeen, a key city in the Scottish anti-fascist movement due to the local presence of William Chambers Hunter, Oswald Mosley's representative in Scotland. Many men who would later fight in Spain took part in street skirmishes with British fascists. One of them was Bob Cooney, who later explained, "I thought we had to smash them off the streets. When the BUF arrived, we'd shout, 'These are the black-shirted bastards who are murdering kiddies in Spain! Spit on them, kids!' Sometimes we'd be too late because the women had already dealt with them." Bill Cranston, an unemployed chimney sweep from Leith, recalled being involved in numerous street scrapes with fascists, drawing direct parallels between the struggles in Scotland and those in Spain. "Something I didn't like at all were the black shirts, the British fascists led by Mosley. Before we volunteered to go to Spain to help the Spanish Republic defend itself against Franco, we used to read a lot about the treatment that the Jews were getting in London at the hands of Mosley's fascists." Opposition to fascism did not always take the form of organised political demonstration or counter-demonstration. For Steve Fullerton, challenging fascism was a personal reaction rooted in his sense of humanity. This was central in persuading him to take up in Spain the fight he had waged in his native Shettleston. Steve said to me, "Fascism was a terrible thing, what it was doing to everybody, trade unionists and politicians who weren't Nazis, things like that. And of course, it was the bombing of civilians that really got on my nerves. I'd go to the cinema and see that on the newsreel. See the women running with the bairns in their hands, eyes turned skywards for the planes to see if they were coming. That was absolutely disgraceful in the 20th century. But it happened. I know it happened. And eventually, that's what drove me to offering to join the international brigades. It was a straightforward thing to say I'd like to join them. All I could do was offer my services and hope it'd be worthwhile. Whether motivated by political conviction or a heartfelt sense of right and wrong, Scots were resolutely moved to fight fascism at home and willing to export that fight abroad. This was underpinned by the notion that if it were not laid to rest in Spain, fascism would come to Britain in the shape of the Second World War, an invasion. Whatever the disparate motivations for going to Spain, Scottish volunteers were overwhelmingly united by their social background. John Dunlop said of his compatriot brigaders, "I only knew one middle-class type, and that was me." Those that fought mainly came from a range of working-class jobs. There were coal miners, painters, printers, engineers, builders, and even a lemonade salesman. There were too a considerable number of unemployed labourers in Spain and a small cluster of middle-class students, obviously unknown to Dunlop. Scots came to be in Spain because they made the cause of the Spanish Republic a further facet of their own domestic struggles, namely those against fascism and for the emancipation of the working class. Having decided to take the plunge and set out for Spain, volunteers for the cause faced a perilous journey. Many had never left Britain before. Many had never even left Perth, Dundee, Glasgow or Aberdeen before. Their journey was to an illegal one, as Britain had signed a non-intervention treaty and invoked a Victorian law to stop Brits participating in Spain's war. If caught in Britain, France or Spain, the volunteers risked lengthy prison sentences for the crime of opposing fascism, just as the British state was appeasing it. In a buoyant atmosphere, Scots were channelled through Glasgow and bus or train to London. Glasgow volunteer Jimmy Maley recalled the sense of adventure boarding the bus engendered. "It was like a Celtic supporters outing. I recognised some of them who'd gone to school with me. From London, they purchased weekend rail and ferry tickets to Paris, the best way to get around the fact that so few of them were wealthy enough to possess passports. In Paris, the men were put up in safe houses till it was time for them to catch a further train to the Pyrenees and then make their way on foot over that range of mountains and into Spain. Silently, they made their way through the night, tripping over branches, rocks, and each other. Despite moments more at home in Dad's army, they made it. Their commitment would not be stunted by a mere broken arm or leg. Volunteer John did not beautifully describe the mood among the many nationalities of volunteers partaking the journey. Exhilaration frothed in our veins. We laughed at the laws and international agreements made to forbid us in our mission, at the venal politicians who had made them, and at the police and military who were charged with the duty of preventing us. A feeling of triumph seemed to trumpet all over us. In these testing, if defiant times, a sense of comradeship was built between the many nationalities taking part in the arduous trek. Dunlop recalled the moment his own party arrived and were treated to coffee in a sing-song at the foot of the Spanish Pyrenees. The singing started. Such singing as I had never heard the like of, each nation singing its own workers' song of protest, till the building became filled with a volume of sound that gradually swelled into one glorious chorale, the Internationale. Sung together in a dozen different tongues, words cannot express the exaltation that surged in our hearts. This was the greatest moment of our lives. This exhilaration was to be short-lived, as the brutality of war and the weaknesses of the Republican army they had volunteered to fight in became clear. On arrival, Scottish volunteers were given 6 weeks of military training. Brigadier George Murray summed up what most felt about this training when he called it more or less useless. Such was the shortage of weaponry until sustained Soviet help arrived. All drills were on a purely theoretical basis, and Steve Fullerton recalled completing shooting practice with broom handles for guns. In spite of this, the men were rapidly sent into battle. They were often to pay the ultimate price for this lack of preparation. In January 1937, the newly formed British battalion containing over 100 Scots was dispatched to the Hammer Valley, southeast of Madrid, despite a lack of preparation and weaponry. Their mission was to defend the Madrid to Valencia road as the nationalists advanced upon the capital. The ill-equipped battalion suffered immediate and considerable losses, and their entire machine gun company, including 15 Scots, was captured and arrested by nationalist forces. Yet slowly, they regrouped, and against all the odds began to hold their own, and when reinforcements came, pushed back the nationalist advance. Inevitably, it came at a price. Well over a quarter of the 500 British battalion men who had gone into battle were killed, and a comparable number invalided home. The number of Scots in each group was high. Those wounded became so in the most agonising of circumstances. Tom Clark, a Dundonian stretcher-bearer, was shot in the head in an area so delicate that doctors refused to remove the bullet. Instead, and without anaesthetic, a dentist extracted the shell. Thomas Brannan, a bricklayer from Blantyre who had taken part in the hunger marches to London, was shot in the head and killed while carrying the stretcher of a Scottish comrade. At the time, his wife stoically wrote, "I am more than proud in my grief of my hero in the way that he is dead. He did not need anyone to urge him to go to Spain. It has been in him all along to go out and fight for the great cause of his comrades. I will always be very proud of him." Around 35 Scottish brigades died during the main days of fighting at Varama. I'll have a walk to a motorbike group. Volunteer Bill Gilmore wrote home at the time, "My heart throbs at the sight of those graves. And as the memory of those boys comes back to me, with all their gestures, jokes and good humour, their political understanding between one another, I can't help but shed a silent tear. Often I think of them when alone in my dugout or on guard at night by my machine gun. If Britain only knew what they owed those dead heroes, they would give them as much room in their sentiments as they give to the unknown soldiers of the Great War." However, that the British battalion were able to achieve even a stalemate after the debilitating early losses they suffered was a breathtaking accomplishment born of the bravery and sheer resilience they had to offer. Holding back the nationalists at Jarama created a sense of optimism, one that compelled the British to believe they were ready to take part in their first offensive rather than defensive action. So it was that in the summer of 1937, the battalion prepared itself for an assault on Brunete, west of Madrid, with the aim of encircling nationalist troops in that area. Their assault was an unmitigated disaster. Of 331 men present on the first day of battle, 289 were killed, wounded or captured by the last. The battalion had been conclusively, brutally routed. In a letter home, shortly afterwards, Alec Donaldson from Coke Bridge commented on the devastation and despair Brunete wrought. I was considerably cut up after the Brunete event. The fact that our best comrades went down in that offensive upset me tremendously. Brunete was a terrible battle and had all the characteristics of a really big one. It will certainly be dwarfed in some of the movements to come, but it has been the first engagement of a really World War character. This was a costly, morale-sapping defeat, and by the autumn of 1937, the British battalion was in dire need of reorganisation and reinforcement. That ultimate price had been emphatically paid. As well as the impact made by the men who fought in Spain, there was too the vital, valiant role played by the many selfless female nurses who travelled to serve. Perhaps most heroic among Scots nurses was Annie Murray. Of the 3 Murray siblings who served in Spain, Annie was the first to volunteer. She arrived there in late September 1936 and was to serve for almost the entire duration of the war. After living in Aberdeenshire and Perthshire, Annie led protests against working conditions while employed at the Edinburgh Royal Infirmary. It was perhaps unsurprising, therefore, that she chose to put a burgeoning nursing career on hold and volunteer for Spain through the British Medical Aid Committee. In her eyes, the decision to go to Spain was straightforward. I went to Spain because I believed in the cause of the Spanish Republican government. I didn't believe in fascism, and I had heard many stories of what happened to people who were under fascist rule. On the Aragon front, despite torrid conditions, Annie and the other nurses provided an outstanding level of commitment and care. No sacrifice was too great for Annie, and she regularly donated her own blood to patients, including 2 pints to her own brother George when he was shot and wounded. As you can imagine, she saw some pretty harrowing sights. In one letter, she wrote, "We have had an extremely busy and rather a depressing time at the hospital here lately. We have been taking all kinds of cases, and I can tell you we've had many very tragic ones among them and many deaths. Many have been shot through the lungs and heads, many legs, arms, abdomen and other injuries. Few of the lung and head cases have recovered. We are certainly seeing war at its worst now. Many just bleed to death. I wish more of the people at home realise what war actually means. Then they might do more to try to prevent it." And the award for the most inappropriate music goes to them. That final remark just hints at the incisive grasp of world events and political acumen that Annie possessed. She was not only caring, but deeply knowledgeable and perceptive, her political convictions heartfelt, but studied. Of all the horror Murray witnessed in Spain, it was an incident later in the conflict that was to seal her lifelong hatred of fascism and warfare. In November 1938, she was working in Portbou, north of Barcelona, when an unusually large intake of child patients arrived in the hospital, all with disfiguring injuries to their hands and faces. Writing to her sister Agnes, Murray related how Italian aeroplanes had dropped pretty little cigarette boxes and chocolate boxes with hand bombs neatly packed inside. The poor little mites of children picking up what they took to be the long-desired chocolate and quickly opening them were suddenly left handless, their faces burned beyond recognition. Nothing could surely be more brutal. What a bloody awful war this has been. A conflict initially waged through field methods mirroring those of the Great War now featured civilian aerial attacks with all their intrinsic callous brutality. As Annie had witnessed, in Spain was modern warfare born. Despite all of this, and despite the Republic's eventual defeat, Annie never regretted her decision to serve, saying in the 1980s, "It was the most important thing of my life. It was a terrific experience I would never like to have missed. I have certainly no regrets at having gone there at all." While women like Annie Murray played a key role in Spain, so too did women take the lead in the Aid for Spain movements that sprang up back here in Scotland. Reaction to Spain's plight was immediate, instinctive, and characterised by a generosity above and beyond the call of duty and the reality of means available. A large proportion of Aid for Spain work was carried out by working class women. They became impassioned supporters of Republican Spain, the volunteers at the home front. Initially, money and food were collected by individuals, forming an unofficial humanitarian response that was to be gradually succeeded by more formal, sustained campaigns. Concerts, fiestas and film showings were staged to raise both funds and awareness, and Flag Days for Spain became a regular feature of Scottish life. Prams were commandeered for collecting food from door to door, tins rattled on street corners, and fundraising events meticulously, prolifically organised. As well as the above-mentioned methods of raising awareness and money, there were unorthodox ones, such as a campaign to provide fish and chips for Spain, and one to create a mile of pennies in every town and village across Scotland. Then a youngster in Fife, Rab Smith, recalled, "We sold a cigarette called Smoke Clouds. We sold them in order to raise money to send to the Spanish Aid Fund. I'm sure they injured the health of the people that smoked them, because they had a terrible smell." Nevertheless, I wasn't concerned. I was concerned about saving Britain and saving the people in Spain. In Montrose, a centre for Basque refugee children was opened, and in Hoyk, a disused mill was occupied by unemployed people and turned into a workers' mill, churning out clothing for soldiers of the Republic. A food ship was organised and took 1,000 tons of food to desperate Republicans towards the end of the war. Whatever the period of struggle against Franco's nationalists, in villages, towns and cities, as individuals or in organisations, Scots, and particularly Scots women, built a solidarity movement of real consequence and clout. Much of their effort went to providing what improvements could be offered to those back over in Spain. Many of the concerns of the mainly first-time Scottish travellers were summed up by volunteer John Miller of Alexandria when he wrote home to a friend, "This place isn't so bad, although it isn't quite as cheerful as Socky Hall Street on a Saturday evening. As a matter of fact, it isn't hellish cheerful at all. You can't drop into Lauders and have a quiet one and have a night at the playhouse. As to women, I haven't spoken to one yet." The Brigade's hierarchy did its very best to make life as comfortable as possible. A welcome system of leave was implemented in entertainment nights held. Wall newspapers full of caricatures and sardonic poetry were run by each company, and football matches a regular occurrence. Cultural committees were established and provided battalion members with gramophones, wireless radios, draft and chess sets, dominoes and a library. Lectures were given on various topics, and schools for the education of illiterate Spanish comrades were formed, with lessons given by British soldiers. Further interest was provided by the visits of public figures such as Clement Attlee and Pandit Nehru, and perhaps more memorably, Paul Robeson and Errol Flynn. One pleasure that many Scots brigaders sorely missed, as well as a pint of heavy, was a British cigarette. Alec Donaldson summed up their agony. "The smokes problem is very acute. We sometimes get one packet per week of cigarettes which have only one claim to the name, the fact that they have the same shape as the genuine article. They are known as anti-tanks, but are twice as deadly. In terms of meals, brigaders were reasonably well fed when behind the lines, but in battle, it could be a different story. David Anderson of Aberdeen recorded desperate hunger eating snakes and snails, while Edinburgh student David Mackenzie's diet consisted of 3 main staples: rice, beans and chickpeas, making tent-based night times a very interesting experience indeed. On the Aragon front, Tommy Bloomfield of Kirkcaldy became so hungry that he began to eat raw onions as if they were apples. Rested though, there were even enough resources for burn suppers and Christmas feasts, not to mention free-flowing local vino, which led predictably to a number of incidents. Steve Fullerton described to me the occasion on which his friend Jimmy Glavin from Govan was sent to collect supplies. At night time, before we went to the Ebro, we used to have a fire and sing-song. They'd get a big jar of wine from the village, so somebody would have to go for it, and a bag of nuts. It came to Jimmy's turn to go into the village one night with somebody else. Jimmy and the other man, off they went into the village. They took a long time to get back. We were getting anxious about them. Eventually, he came back, drunk as can be. Somebody got onto him. "Where have you been?" "I've been in the village for wine and nuts." By this time, we picked up the jar. "You've been drinking it?" "Well," he said, "it was heavy." Scots, though, generally assimilated well into Spanish life. Many learned the language so proficiently that they could put local women off at 10 paces. At every turn they were lauded, possibly the only time in history a foreign army has been so welcome in another country's war. As Brigadier James Walker, World War I veteran from Airdrie, wrote, This is something different from the last war. We know what we're fighting for this time. The kiddies hold up their hands in the red front salute and greet us as we pass. I'm proud to be fighting for the Spanish people and for democracy. To those Spanish people, this bunch of miners, shoe repairmen and printers have become heroic saviours. Life in Spain needed comforts like vino and welcomes like those offered by locals, because back in battle, things continued to be difficult at best and horrific at worst. Having gathered themselves and welcomed new recruits following the calamity of Brunete, the British battalion had moved eastwards towards Aragon, the region sandwiched between Madrid and Catalonia. They immediately captured the important town of Quinto from the clutches of the nationalists. Heartened by this success, the Republicans moved on to Fuentes de Ebro, a town beside the strategically vital River Ebro, with the aim of seizing it, moving into the surrounding valley ahead of an advance on Zaragoza. It was an objective they fell catastrophically short of completing. Regardless of their calamitous experience at Fuentes, the British contingent of the Republican Army pressed on to Belchite, emerging victorious from a traumatic rash of hand-to-hand combat with the nationalists. Hugh Sloan recalled the unique nature of combat at Belchite. Belchite was a particular kind of battle at close quarters. You were seeing the person you were killing. That's a different thing from killing people at a distance. In that respect, it was a very bitter battle. The British battalion did manage some successes in this period, for instance playing a key part in capturing the town of Teruel. These gains escalated the feelings within the battalion that Republican success was now inevitable. Sadly, this optimism soon ebbed away as the British battalion were forced from the end of January into a series of retreats amidst a fierce nationalist onslaught. Franco's forces powered into Teruel and forced the Republicans to decamp some 70 miles over the following days, brutally taking back Belchite as they did so. They were eventually forced back to Calafete, where, at the end of March, over 100 were ambushed and imprisoned. The battalion, now just 80 strong, retreated to Gandesa before the nationalists pushed them out and back over the River Ebro, where a retreat of 125 miles finally came to a halt. By the summer of 1938, Franco's army was advancing rapidly on Madrid. The response of the Republican High Command was to instigate an audacious raid southwards over the River Ebro and into nationalist territory. In late July, the British battalion were informed they would be among an army of 80,000 Republicans undertaking this forward surge. It was, for once, a monumental success, as Scots and every other nationality that made up the International Brigade streamed over the river into enemy territory. A day after their safe passage over the Ebro, the battalion were back in offensive action. They became stymied by a determined nationalist defensive operation, and British casualties in particular quickly mounted during 6 days of intensive fighting in the mainland summer swelter of Spain. Though the British battalion were hopelessly equipped against the war machine of Hitler's Condor Legion, there were a few honourable and fairly spectacular victories for them in this period, before finally their withdrawal from Spain was announced. After a gallant, dogged resistance, the Spanish-only Republican army was subsequently pushed back towards Madrid, and their eventual defeat began to appear inevitable. On October 29, 1938, a parade was held in Barcelona in honour of the homebound International Brigade, with hundreds of thousands of Spaniards lining the streets. Bill Cranston described the occasion. "I really wanted to cry. We got a tremendous reception from the people of Barcelona, and it's a thing I'll never forget. Never." And so came home the soldiers of the International Brigades. On December 7, 1938, the majority of the British battalion pulled into Victoria Station to be met by a crowd of 20,000 eager to welcome home their heroes. The brigade was then marched to Downing Street and took part in a number of protest events before the Scots finally departed for home and further rapturous welcomes in Glasgow, Edinburgh and Dundee. There was a certain amount of regret among brigaders, as Thomas Quinn from Newmains told the Glasgow Herald journalist on the platform at Central Station. "In one way, we're very glad to be home again and to see our friends here, but I think that all of us feel that we would like to have stayed on and to have fought the war to finish." The Spanish Civil War had a remarkable effect on Scotland and provided a great cause around which all the progressive movements of the 1930s could find their ideals embodied. Not only do we rightly commemorate it with statues, but also in our actions today by pledging to oppose whatever creed fascists are. Though expressing his pride at being part of the International Brigade, Steve Fullerton could have been referring to pro-Republican Scotland in its entirety when he movingly said, "Here were a body of men who I don't think will ever be equalled in their intensity of purpose, trying to eliminate fascism. There are many people who set out on different jobs and they fall by the wayside, but not them. And that's been my pride, that I was one of them. That's something to be proud of."
It's very insightful. Talk that you gave there to the volunteers for the National Brigades. I'm sure we've all got questions for Daniel, so I think we'll open it up for some discussion.
Just quickly, I just am interested. How many Irish, Welsh and English volunteered for the international?
This is it where I get caught out with being 6 years since I studied all of this, but Scots made up, there was around 3,000, but the Irish, a lot more went on the other side from Ireland to fight for. So that was an interesting history. But I had to do a meeting in Belfast, which was interesting on that from a few years ago. I remember that. That was still causing a few interesting divisions. But it's definitely well worth reading up on that one as well. You wouldn't get such a one-sided book as mine about Ireland, I think.
I was just interested, I mean, there were people from Ireland and Wales as well.
Absolutely, yeah. And those books there's some brilliant books about them. And in fact, the overall history of the British Battalion generally, which includes chapters on Ireland, came out last year. Is the most comprehensive book you can get on that, which Richard Baxell took years and years researching.
Any follow-up questions?
I'll ask another.
Did the Scottish wear kilts or play bagpipes or anything? Do you identify them as were Scottish?
I don't have any record of kilts actually. I suppose that must have a bit to do with the evolution of kilts and the way traditionally working class men didn't wear kilts back then as much, and your Sunday best was your suit, wasn't it, not a kilt. I don't know if there were a kilt wearing type, but I didn't come across any kilts, or there was a real sense of integration with nationality, and a lot of the stuff my book's based on is letters from the March Memorial Library and the National Library of Scotland. A lot more of bonding among Scotsmen was done around cultural experiences, like which pubs they drank in back home and which political groups they were in. I don't think there was much, how does an Englishman say this, after a referendum? There was much strong patriotism, it was all about internationalism most often. And seeing difference as well, especially when they played England at football and things like that. It's an interesting one. I remember doing a talk in a school at the question point, and the only question was, did they smoke pipes? Which I liked. Couldn't have an answer to that either. So kilts and pipes I'll have to look up next time.
Just some of that. If anybody else wants, it's okay. I'm not trying to hog it, but okay. Just a couple of things in my mind. I'm interested in actually the history of the war. What brought the Republic into being? What was the conditions at the time that, the political conditions at the time that they made? It was elected Republican government, elected to leave, I make it wrong there. And I'd like to know what was the composition of that government. Was it mixed of communists, socialists, was there royalists, were fascists in that government? What was the thing that government was? And once the war took place, I'd like to find out as well, not all for questions here, what part was played by Truman in it. If you can maybe elaborate on those things for me. Thank you.
Well, that's why you got the half-hour talk, because I didn't mention the splits in the left. It's not so easy to either do an hour and a half talk or a half-hour talk by missing it all out on the poop front. But in terms of the government as well, as you say, it was the Second Republic, and there weren't any communists in the government, but it was they'd done a lot of things that annoyed the establishment as such, especially on women's rights and taking land from landowners and redistributing it to peasants, and it very much annoyed this political class. They weren't particularly fascist, they were fascist in it, but Franco wasn't a fascist at that point. He hadn't really discovered anything as intelligent as ideology. He was an ex-soldier, part of that cabal that just resented these very progressive measures that were taking place, and all they could see fit to do to get rid of it was a military coup, basically, with a plane borrowed from Britain, as far as I remember. And on the, as you say, on the coup front, well, Scots were involved with the... Has anyone seen Land and Freedom, the film? Because that concentrates very much on that split. And some Scots went and weren't part of the international brigades. There's a couple of chapters in the book about that, whether they fought or not, and a couple were alongside Orwell and things. But the thing that came across amongst letters, as I say, the main resources and things, was that they were really annoyed more than anything about the infighting, because it had taken the eye off the ball so much. And of course, a lot of them wanted to export this revolution home as part of the politics, but they were annoyed about this infighting. But especially retrospectively, the brigaders that lived on into the 70s and 80s were annoyed that the Spanish Civil War was becoming characterised by this left infighting instead of the good things that happened in the unity. And I think that was interesting. It was interesting reading how much a lot of the surviving brigaders that saw that film hated Land and Freedom for what it portrayed, really resented it. John Dunlop, I mentioned there, a 12-page review I remember coming across, and I thought, it's longer than the whole film, this review. But so that hurt them a lot, I think, the portrayal of Spain in that way. I don't come down on either side in that book. It's deep to know the answers to that. It's better on the fence there and cause an argument maybe.
I think it's better to stay defence and predict the past.
Yeah.
You know, and certainly I think with Land and Freedom, certainly I had the privilege to speak to some of the surviving brigaders, and I think we felt that it was part of trying to discredit them. They'd been discredited at the time by the establishment, and then they found themselves prejudged, if you like, by history, by folk who, in their eyes, hadn't done a hand's turn for the movement. You know, I know this hasn't. One of the things that's my question. One of the things I've always found a bit perplexing just about the whole Spanish War is that Franco's troops were in fact the Moors, and in fact he had North African forces in the name, in the front line, fighting internationalists who were fighting for the free. And I just wonder, has anything ever been done about the colonial troops? And I kind of think
I can't answer it. I would say so. My specialism stops in here, really, but it does, yeah. I think there's probably a little bit of slavery, element of slavery in that, and other things. And but I guess it has, because most areas of this have been done now. But I'll answer honestly instead of pretending I'm on question time and talking for 2 minutes.
Yes, the next book.
If only someone would pay me to go to sit down.
Just briefly, and anecdotally, my granddad, George Deaver, was in Iberia, and he was captured and then imprisoned, and he was captured by Moors. She did find it particularly ironic because one of his co-brigaders, who didn't know particularly well, had been in the British Army and had served in China, and as they were being captured and didn't know what was going to happen to them, the guy became more and more nervous and said to George, I don't like this at all. And my granddad George had laughed and said, of course you don't like it. He said, not long ago you were in China bullying the Chinese, he said, and now you're here being bullied by the Moors. So obviously there was some acknowledgement of this irony of the situation.
Yeah. And Grandad George was the best story about him, about turning up, about the death.
Yes, a number of stories shared. He was captured, but he was declared missing, presumed dead, and so back in Edinburgh, there was obviously distress. He had died. There was a couple of memorial meetings in Leith, organised by the Communist Party and another group. And subsequently the death certificate arrived, which was very important because my great-grandmother, his mother, was able to claim £half a crown in insurance, which was never paid back. He then returned in January.
You can get insurance companies.
You can sometimes. Anyway, the famous story is that George has, 2 death certificates. He is in fact dead now, obviously.
Turned up at home. It happened a few of them that they turned up at home.
Yes, actually.
Give the mothers a bit of a shock.
Yeah, it was very, I often think it was
Lovely
very
shock.
shocking for his mother and possibly for they weren't yet married, for my granny as well, because I often wondered what she'd been doing in the meantime. But they went on to get married anyway.
I've never thought of that before. I actually came across nothing to do with your granddad, but lots of personal matters in the letters home, which were unpublishable like that as well, that reminded me of about affairs and heartbreaking ones of women writing to Brigaders saying, I've met someone else. It was just a thought. You have to take a decision at that point if you're sensationalist or not, don't you? That's the novel that'll actually make some money.
I knew a fellow who was a volunteer, and he used to, it was 1946, he used to always be singing the tango tune. Some call him Pablo. Some say he's a dreamer. Some say he's lazy, others crazy. Do you think that when he come back, they felt it was all worthwhile?
According to, again, everything, the one brigadier I knew, Steve Fullerton, it was certainly worthwhile. Yeah, I didn't see, there's obviously regrets, especially about the British government not doing anything to help them, and the treatment they got when they came back. They were pretty much blacklisted from work and from joining the army, even though they were experts at fighting fascism at first. But I didn't detect any regret. Lots of them saw it as the first act of World War II in a positive way, that the eventual defeat of Hitler had started in Spain, which is quite a hard thing to get your head around at first because they were defeated. But you have to remember what optimistic people these were and what open people that saw the world in such a way that you could go with broom handles and beat Hitler. And there's a certain outlook about that, and I think even Hitler couldn't defeat that spirit, although there was a lot of short-term, and there was bitterness through the years, of course, as well. And when they were repatriated, they all got bills from the British government for their repatriation, which there's no record of any of them paying.
Now, this fellow, when he came back, he was blacklisted. He was an engineer, couldn't get a job. So he emigrated to America, and then he was joining trade unions and so on, become active there, and get deported back to Britain again. So he had a hard life. He actually died in 1940. He only had 10 years to live after. He lost an eye in the war as well. So yeah, he had it hard. Got divorced because he was difficult to live with. So these things.
There's definitely, I suppose as I'm speaking about the public reactions, but there's definite effects on families. I know a daughter of Brigade who said there was always a second person in the marriage, and it was the Spanish Civil War for the next 40 years of the marriage. It was an obsession and things. And yeah, it's easy for an outsider like me to romanticise things. But yeah, of course, there must have been horrible effects, and no counselling then. I'm sure they wouldn't have been allowed it if it had been available, such as the treatment.
Something I was surprised about reading some years ago was one of Jack Jones's pals in Spain was in fact Edward Heath, and Edward Heath was a supporter of the Republican and the Brigaders who in fact went to Spain. Is there any other examples of people who were not on the left or were the Brigaders exclusively?
I suppose a lot of the adventurers, the big portrayal of the Spanish Civil War was about poets and aristocrats and things, and I don't suppose some of those were on there. I mean, Churchill's nephew was there fighting for the Republic. Not huge evidence, but there would have been. There were apolitical people. There was a small percentage of adventurers. No doubt it had to be a bit adventurous. And I don't think they were particular. I mean, even Steve Fullerton, his reasons for going were really visceral about that sheer thing of seeing dead kids being held by mums. And And he said to me again and again, he was so intimidated when he got to Spain, and they could all quote Marx, and they were all massively into politics, and he was always about the cinema and things. It was in his heart. So that's it became politicised though, because it's quite inevitable.
Michael Portillo's father was a communist. Split, actually his brothers fought with the fascists, and he ended up living in London. I think he was a toilet cleaner or something. He was a professor. He ended up in London as a toilet cleaner. It's amazing. Yeah, Michael Portillo tough to you know.
His mother was a nurse. The nurse was further back to him.
Did he?
If she hadn't bothered, who knows how pain might have averted and that.
Was there a religious divide of those who went in terms of Roman Catholic?
Oh, from here, yeah, that's really interesting. I was often looking for that in letters, having already lived here for a while and known about, you know, modern issues and things, and it just again wasn't something I came across. That sense of unity seemed to override a lot of things, but I'm sure there was. I mean, I remember writing in the book about in Shettleston and the strength of the Catholic Church did make for opposition locally, and the church was, you know, against these people going and things. But once they got to Spain, I didn't find record of sectarian fighting. It might have come out in those football matches, I don't know, but it just seems to have been a lot of things were not forgotten but put to one side in the sake of that solidarity. And that's an ideal that I was very pleased to find evidenced rather than just in my heart.
Whereas with the Irish who fought on Franco's side, one of the slogans was like killing a commie for Christ, and it was worth so many years. I'm not up in what it is, but it was worth so many years plenary indulgence, which meant if you were a blue shirt and you killed a communist in Spain, you get into heaven quicker, which is a bizarre notion. One of the slogans was kill a commie for Christ.
Fast track.
Fast track. Fast track, is that what it is? So is that like being at the front of the queue EasyJet? You just go straight away?
But Duffy's Club is, as far as I'm aware, the only one in history which actually came back to Ireland with more people than they set out.
And a parade down a Coral Street as heroes.
No, Brian was the Spanish Fourth Legion, Catalonia, after the incidents. When Duffy's call arrived there, he says, "Oh, good, you have them."
Did they have any show trials?
In Spain, as you mean of leaders and things? Youth repression and, you know.
What happened?
Of British ones. All, as far as I know, got home eventually. Some, like in France, some were killed once the Nazis got to France because they were still in camps there. So that was a double tragedy, I suppose, if that's possible. But yeah, some prisoners were killed in Spain. Like Jimmy Rutherford from Leith, like Grandad George, was captured the first time. He was only a young lad. They said, right, you can go. They swapped him and said, never went back to Spain. But lad didn't last long back in Leith. Went home, captured again, recognised and killed. So yeah, they were particularly gruelling stories of the prisoners. In fact, I don't know if there's a play called from the Calton's Catalonia that Jimmy and Willie Maley and his brother wrote years ago. It's on every now and again, and that's
Just been republished?
yes. It's great. It's worth reading, especially going to see, obviously. And if you can capture the old video of it, there are lots of people who went on to be in River City on, which is quite amusing. But and that's a great play that gets under what it was like to be in prison waiting for in Spain, waiting for the agony wagon to take them away.
So they actually tortured them.
Various methods and psychological. Every day the van came and they'd say, "Tomorrow you die," in Spanish, and then every day they'd say it again and again. Agony wagon. So it's very psychological.
think it's generally accepted that the Spanish Civil War was a week or something.
Yeah.
Then we had the operation at Catalonia, the Congo region. Can you give us a kind of information on that?
On what, sorry? On the Condor Legion with the German Air Force that tested a lot of its methods and bombs on Spain, and that's what Guernica was essentially, was the testing of bombs. And it was able to perfect a lot of the methods that are used to flatten different bits of, the world, really. And it was very important for Hitler having that playground to use these new technologies on. And that's why it was the first war with that modern carpet bombing and those methods, and that's why these men would be, and women would have been so useful straight into the British forces and the Allied forces to use their intelligence that they had, but they were banned for a while. So that's.
Is that how Guernica was used?
Yeah, to test.
Blitzkrieg.
Yeah, exactly.
You've been to Mallorca, that's the airport you land at, that's where they took off from to bomb around Guernica. I mean, the thing about Spain, it throws up all those sort of things. We think of Spain as a place that, we've all been to Mallorca, you go there for your holidays and that, and even if you go to places like Alicante, if you get into the last stand, the last place to surrender was actually an Air Force battery at Santa Polo, just above Alicante, and there's actually plaques there to the Welsh coal ships that come over to evacuate people. And I find that going to Spain, you're walking about and, it's the war is all around you, but you don't see it because it's all about bars and all the rest of it. And then you hit this plaque and it's to a guy who brought a coal ship over from Wales to evacuate from Alicante.
And it's happening more, well, generally the recognition of the war in Spain is happening more and more because, obviously during the Franco era there was nothing, and then there was a pact of silence to establish democracy. And in some areas like Catalonia they've got plaques, a museum, it's all over. Aragon doesn't recognise it much, even though that's where most of the fighting was done. Belchite is the town that was left by Franco in 1939, exact as it was that day, and rebuilt exact next to it, so you can walk around it. But when I've been twice, and it's incredible, it's haunting. You can see the walls as they were bombed. It's like when you watch news of Syria and things now. And when the first 2 times I went, there was no plaques, there was nothing to keep it up, and it was just falling away and it wouldn't be there soon. I think they're doing something with it now. But it's a very political history in Spain still, so a lot of the plaques that are going up are due to the work of people in this country and other foreign countries who are. But the main memorial in Spain to the Brigade is near Madrid, up a hill near a village, Morata de Tojuña, and it keeps, every year it gets paint splashed on it by modern fascists and it gets desecrated. And every year there's a fundraiser and we put it up again.
There must have been a lot of British ships that broke the blockade.
Yeah.
They were those seafarers that were widely recognised through the International Brigade. But there was there's a book called The Ships that broke the Brigade. So there is a lot more people were actually involved that probably didn't get the recognition.
Like the boys in the coal ship.
The Welsh were that. But there was quite a few ships sailed for Scotland for Glasgow where they were quite prepared, and that must have put the crew in quite a precarious position with the ship owners. There's not much recognition.
No, yes. I think the bizarrest fact, though, that I think I've just through a kind of casual hunt about the reading Spanish Civil War film is that Dad's Army was founded by Major Tom Whittingham, who was a major in the International Brigades, and he came back with the view of what he saw in Spain. He says, what we need is a people's militia. What we need is a workers' militia to defend this country, because we can't rely on the ruling class because they're likely to go to fascism. And he was allowed to do that, I think, for about 18-20 months. And then the ruling class realised what he was organising, and they took him out and put in bank managers and things like that to the head instead of international brigaders who have come back. But even today, I mean, like the books that he wrote, like Guerrilla Warfare, People's War, New Ways of War, are still textbooks for revolutionary organisations that he wrote for the Home Guard as a result of his experiences in Spain, which is quite bizarre when you watch Dad's Army, when you know what his genesis was. It's strange. And there was a lot of people like that, you know, I think, who came back and weren't allowed to join the army until 1941, you know, because having served a foreign power, you were ineligible to join the British Army. So the guys that knew Mason fighting fascism weren't allowed to go.
If I remember an anecdote many years ago, Bob Cooney told me about after the war, and eventually when he joined up, and he was in the War of Artillery, and he fought an election after the general election after the war for the party, for the Communist Party, and the slogan was "Vote for Gunner Cooney." And I remember him telling me he was on guard duty outside some depot, and a couple of the officers were returning, and he stepped manfully forward with his rifle and asked them to identify themselves. And one of the officers said, "Bob Cooney, you bastard, what are you doing here?" And the other officer was really taken aback by this familiarity of the officer with a common gunner like Bob Cooney. He said, the one officer says to the other, "Oh, Bob was my commanding officer in Spain." And you know, however you characterise the war, and I think there are certain kind of elements that have a vested interest in portraying the war in Spain as being a poet's war, an intellectual's war, a war where it was the intellectuals and what have you, and whatever kind of working class elements there were, didn't really know what there was, an element of naivety about it and what have you. But that clearly manifestly was not the case. It was not a poet's war, an intellectual's war. It was a people's war against fascism. And the movement that arose in support of the Spanish Republic in Britain and all over the world was actually a people's movement. And the movement, the character of the movement that eventually defeated fascism militarily in 1945, and if it wasn't completely destroyed, it was defeated militarily, was a people's movement. And just as the only country internationally that provided aid and succour to the Spanish Republic was the Soviet Union, so it was that the Soviet Union tore the guts out of the Nazi war machine, which led to fascism military defeat in 1945. But it is important, I think, for people to remember that it was a people's movement against fascism, a people's war against fascism, a people's movement against fascism in Scotland. And certainly Bob Cooney was very clear. I mean, it was a funder. There was fantastic anecdotes about the character of the anti-fascist movement in Aberdeen. And they had kids were involved, women were involved, and the kids would be acting as messengers and what have you, and sort of riding all over sort of up and down Union Street on the bikes and things like that, and taking messages to various bits of the sort of anti-fascist pickets and so on and so forth. And that, I think, is one of the great kind of lessons of today is that, you know, the defeat of reaction, whether it's in the form of UKIP or whether it's in the form of the Tories, getting rid of the Tories at the next election, whatever, it has to be a people's movement. And that's what we need to remember is actually it's the degree of unity in the people's movement that will ensure the victory of the people's movement at the end of the day. But you know, more than being anti-fascist, we have to be for something. We are not just opposed to fascism. We are not just opposed to austerity. We are for a better form of society. And it seems to me that because of that, the men and women who went out to Spain to fight, their contribution to that people's movement against fascism, the people's war against fascism, is much more than a passing historical interest. They embody the finest, the best, most positive instincts of the British Labour movement and indeed the Labour movement international. And yes, there were poets, yes, there were intellectuals who went out to Spain and what have you, but it was a people's movement against a people's war, and it was a people's movement back home actually that supported the Spanish Republic. And that's something I think that is, you know, absolutely, it's something that we can take the greatest pride in as part of our culture and part of our history. It's not part of the culture of the ruling class, it's part of our culture. And I think we should be, you know, immensely proud of that. And I have to say, on a personal note, every time I come into this building and I look up at that wooden panel with all those names up there, I think, wow, what a fantastic thing to be part of. And it's something I think you would, I mean, the expression I think you used was, it was in his heart, absolutely. Well, it's in our hearts as well, all these years later. But it is of more than passing historical interest. That's why we're sitting here discussing it.
Yeah, it's a very good point you made there. Certainly history, we can always take things out of history, we can always use it and adapt it to how we challenge those very same issues today. You touched on it earlier on, Daniel, it's maybe is outwardly fascist, but certainly, you know, looking at fascist elements throughout Europe, and of course, you know, they're here in the UK as well. So certainly, yeah, you know, it's was a people's movement. I think for going to challenge racism and fascism in our communities, in our country. Again, it's going to come from us. It's not going to be governments, you know, it's going to be down to people and, you know, working class people. Again, you know, it's so important that Daniel and other people have got an accurate account of what happened, and it's also been made out of the TV series, we know, that's there, you know, for posterity for years. And the reason for that being is that, you know, obviously the time goes on, the active volunteers die, and then we can then see revisionism creeping in, and the, you know, the story getting warped to suit certain people's own agenda. So really pleased that, you know, we've got this account here and that can be used for, you know, future generations, as can, of course, you know, the multitude of interviews, etc., that was used for the Scottish Fort Franco. And again, you know, the kind of the monuments as well, I think, play a very, very important part, or should play an important part, because we can't forget the immense sacrifice, you know, that these people, members of their families and people in their family, you know, made in actually fighting fascism in Spain. So really, you know, they can't be forgotten. And we've got a plaque out there which anybody walks in, traffic, the public, plaque is mentioned in Custom House Quay. Personally, I'd like to see a kind of annual event based around that. You know, I think the way it is now, it's maybe just kind of maybe certain celebrations or commemorations that's used. That, you know, certainly I'd like to see a biannual event. You know, everybody get involved in, you know, the memory, the volunteers certainly remembered, and, you know, if that was kind of done throughout the country, we would certainly be much more up on our history, as you said. Again, I think that should be taken into schools, it should be put into history, modern studies classes, because that's part of our history, very valuable history, you know, and obviously very, very important. Certainly would give people a sense of, you know, what could go on in the past, and certainly, you know, as I said, how can we try and adapt that to future issues.
80th anniversary next year, Bram. Maybe that's something that Hope Not Hate should organise.
Yeah, well, certainly. Yeah.
For your information, the International Brigade Memorial Trust do have a mobile these pop-up exhibitions, and it's absolutely fantastic.
Maybe that's on the show.
You know, it's something that we should try and get in the schools. There's no doubt about that.
I think it's still in Scotland, actually. I think someone's got it in
wait,
Norwich somewhere.
I think
Where's it got now?
Manchester.
The email they're asking.
The museum in Manchester, I think that's where it is right now. But there's two of them.
Yeah.
There's two.
I think the thing with memorials, as ever, is that the local council are a bit more supportive now, and the government certainly won't make memorials, and that's why they're all away from cenotaphs and other things, which probably the men would have preferred. But if you think of yours here, it's right by the Clyde, it's nowhere. You walk past much, you make an effort to go, we do. And in Kirkcaldy, it's in like on a roundabout almost, way back from everything. In Edinburgh, it's hidden in Princess Street Gardens, and not many folk know they're there, and that was on purpose. And these memorials only came about because of fundraising by people like us that we're talking about it today. And every year, for 5 years now since I got involved, we do a commemoration at our one. the unions have been great. They always give us a contribution for flowers and things. And we held the IBMT, the International Brigade Memorial Trust AGM around it last year. And I've been encouraged in the last couple of years that younger folk are really getting into it. I've done a couple of things in schools because some teachers are able to get it into modern studies and other things like that. And that's been good, and it appeals to young folk because of that black and white, right and wrong, which is good, especially when you're a teenager and you're trying to see the world like that yourself. And so hard to find today, the highest idea of fighting and not being made to fight. So there's got a lot in it for children, for younger people to get them involved. And that's what's encouraged me at our events is actually that the passing of Steve Fullerton, the last Scottish Brigader, has, I thought, oh, it's been handed, the history's been handed, the baton's been handed, the history and the fighting fascism or opposing fascism. And brilliantly, a lot of young folk have taken it on, and I don't mind if they get on board because of the romance of it, because of that high ideal. Because once they get interested, they find the reality of the brutality of war and stuff. It's been encouraging the last few years at the events we've had, and young Spanish people come along as well. So that's a good thing. It's not dying out by any stretch. It's galvanised the whole.
We're very proud of keep that going and keep it
Yeah, I'm just going to say, following on to what Dan was saying there, I mean, if people here aren't already members of the International Brigades Memorials Trust, please join up. They've got a website. It's easy enough to do. As Dan and other people have said, they have events every year. Every July they have a commemoration at the International Brigades monument, which is in the South Bank in London, and they rotate their AGM. I think it might be going to be in Scotland again next year. Yeah, I'm not entirely sure, and they help with either establishing new memorials or reviving existing ones people had forgotten about. And I mean, so it's a great way to show your support. It's also important, I think, bearing in mind some of the points that a number of comments have made, including the RAP, about the sort of historical revision about what the war in Spain was about, because IBMT grew out of the International Brigades Association, which was the association of the International Brigaders, the volunteers, men and women themselves, and they were very keen, understandably so, that should be their organisation. It should represent their views about why they went, what actually happened, and they were very, very protective of the legacy. We heard a bit about what all of them thought about land and freedom, and I've certainly been at meetings, 30 years ago, and heard many of them become, very exercised indeed about some of the revisionist tactics. So another reason for people like us to get involved is to help protect the legacy from the very people. And they're not all on the right, unfortunately. The people that are wanting to challenge what the Spanish Civil War was actually about, and the lessons that we can draw from that today. So as I say, please, everybody, if you're not already a member, join up.
Very good question. That's all.
Is it taught a different way in the Spanish schools, the education system, for the Franco era to the era now?
Well, I'm not sure that any are teaching it yet. I know some were going to, especially in Catalonia. I'm not going on about Catalonia or anything for any reason, but they have had a bit of a more open attitude to the Civil War. But I'm not sure. I'll have to check, because it certainly hasn't been. It'll be taught a little bit, I think, now, but certainly for years and years, even after Franco, it wasn't taught. All you got was if your family wanted to talk about it, and it still divides families now. You still have families that don't speak to each other in religious things. Thanks for coming.
It's just recently, I'm sure you know, this become a topic in itself in the Scottish Advanced Higher curriculum, which is
I like to think we had a bit of an influence on that, because a lot we've been going on about for long enough.
I'm sure a lot of it is too, due to your own efforts, Daniel.
We hope so. It's good. It's a good thing.
However, the way it's getting presented in schools is
Few reasons for British people. Reasons for pressure, reasons.
Alright,
Right, public opinion doesn't want war. Look at Guernica, why would we want that blood? As opposed to look at Guernica, look at these fascists.
There's still work to be done.
Any questions?
I don't want to prolong the meeting, but just it occurred to me just as I mean, Simon was talking about, the fact that it's, it was the working class movement, and even today we see with modern media how manipulative, capitalist media is, and making a railroad for the likes of UKIP, and say, well, look at, the fact that we're in this crisis is obviously because of the immigrants, and so on. So going back to the Spanish Civil War, I'm wondering just, how did media portray it at the time in Britain? Were there obviously, the Daily Worker, I'm sure, was reporting, and I think I've certainly seen pictures of like Harry Pollitt, and so on, addressing.
Daily Worker nearly every day. I went through all 3 years of Daily Workers. And that was the main, that covered it every day, but as you might expect, most of the other papers were either neutral or vehemently pro-Franco, and obvious candidate, but the Daily Mail reported that these brigades were being paid an awful lot of money to go there, and all this, so it's just as they are now, basically, but we know that. Hostile press, I think it's fair to say, apart from the papers of the left. And in Scotland, as far as I've got, I haven't got a chance, but I've forgotten, it's 4 books ago, the Herald was neutral, really.
just anecdotally again on a chair note, when George was a prisoner of war, which wasn't a pleasant experience, exactly as Daniel had said, and as well as being tortured and threatened with death, they were also being starved essentially as well. But one morning they broke up to a visit from the Gestapo, which wasn't at all unknown. They regularly came into the camp and helped, with the business of the day essentially. But this day they had brought in cameras because they were making a propaganda film to be shown in Germany and presumably, elsewhere in Europe as and when, to prove how well their prisoners were being treated in the camps. And part of that was that all of the prisoners were given out an orange to eat, which, was like heaven, complete heaven. The funny part of the story was that they were given an orange and something else, bread and butter, again, unusual. And George Drever, my granddad, who was a dialectical materialist, said immediately to his comrades, "Eat that orange first." And they said, no, we're going to have our bread and butter or whatever, or our soup, and we'll have the orange for pudding. He said, if I were you, he said, I would eat that orange first. Anyway, some of them presumably did eat it first. He certainly ate his first. And he was very glad that he did so, because they finished the filming very quickly and then back round the prisoners and collected the uneaten oranges back in. Presumably to be used
as food torture.
Maybe any more questions? I think I'll just one more from that. I know you covered Derek Blair, you mentioned Derek Blair, George Orwell. Did George Orwell actually participate in Spanish Civil War?
It seems so. It mentioned in a few letters of David Murray from the Independent Labour Party, but the thing that I remember about him writing about Eric is that he was, because Orwell went on and on about this being shot through the throat, and he made wrote a lot about it. And I've got that letter, I was staggered by that letter, it was brilliant, and it says, I saw Eric in Barcelona looking quite the thing walking about town. That's after he'd been shot through the neck, which I quite liked. So yeah, he was mentioned in a couple of letters as actually being there. I'm not sure it was the London Freedom hero.
Or use like an artistic license?
Yeah, possibly.
If anybody's any further questions, local deal. Before we get done, another round of applause. Just get a
Before he said before.
Firstly, also get Hope Not Hate material, put it back, and if you're not on the Hope Not Hate Glasgow email list, we'll get a sheet in there, you'll put your name on it, you'll get the star there, it just comes directly to yourselves, a lot of useful information, local events, etc. We've also got another 2 meetings coming up as part of the STUC, our future briefing racism. On Friday night we've got this TITA, the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, as a racist policy. That's Glasgow City Unison branch in Dale Street, 6:30 PM. And on Saturday we've got a meeting with Jess Smith, who is a Scottish traveller, talking about her experiences and discrimination that she's faced over the years, and that's at the library at 1 o'clock Saturday afternoon. Also as well, there's a Latin American conference taking place at STUC this Sunday at 11 AM. I think the chair is Vicky Grandin. There's also speakers as well from the Ecuadorian embassy, who of course were always made very progressive policies in the last few years. As was mentioned before, please also consider supporting the International Brigade's Loan Trust. You can join individually for about £20 a year. If you're an organisation, it's roughly about £35, so that's another very worthwhile thing to do. Lastly, if you don't buy the Morning Star on a regular basis, then please seriously consider that. Its coverage with regards to anti-racism articles, anti-fascism articles is absolutely second to none. Just for that coverage alone is really worth buying, and buying that on a regular basis. As well as it's also a vital tool combating the government propaganda and scapegoating that we're currently getting with immigration. So really consider buying the Morning Star. I think we're going to have a collection as well for the start.
The minutes here.
So just put in as much of this letter as you can afford. Thanks very much for attending, and I think thanks also to our speaker, Daniel.